Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first of several training sessions put together by NCME Scaling, Linking, and Equating SIGME, or SLE SIGME for short. Thank you for joining us in this inaugural training session. I am Jamie Malatesta, and I am one of the co-chairs of the SLE SIGME, with the other being Stella Kim. I will be moderating today's training session that will be given by Dr. Brennan and is titled Introduction to Equating. If you have any questions during the session, please ask them in the chat box or wait until Dr. Brennan opens it up for questions. Before continuing, I'd like to give you all a brief introduction to Dr. Brennan. Dr. Robert L. Brennan is the E.F. Lindquist Chair in Measurement and Testing Emeritus and the founding director of the Center for Advanced Studies in Measurement and Assessment, CASMA, in the College of Education of the University of Iowa. Dr. Brennan received his doctoral degree from Harvard Graduate School of Education. He is the author or co-author of numerous journal articles and several books, including Generalizability Theory in 2001 and Test Equating, Scaling, and Linking Methods and Practices in 2014. Also, he is the editor of the 4th edition of Educational Measurement, published in 2006. Dr. Brennan has served as president of the National Council on Measurement and Education, NCME, and vice president of Division D of the American Educational Research Association, AERA. He is the co-recipient of the 2000 NCME Award for Career Contributions to Educational Measurement, the recipient of the 2004 E.F. Lindquist Award for Contributions to the Field of Educational Measurement, sponsored by the AERA and ACT, and recipient of the 2011 Career Achievement Award from the Association of Test Publishers, and the recipient of the 2020 AERA Division D Lynn Award. Thank you, Dr. Brennan, for volunteering your time to be here today, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. Okay, let's see if I can do this right. Try sharing my screen. And just a second. How's that look?
Looks good.
All right. Okay.
Yep.
And I'm going to go into presenter view for myself. And so presumably you can all see the original slides, correct? I'm
Yes.
just looking at the presenter view.
Yes.
Okay, one more second. I want to do something else. Pick up a laser pointer. Okay, how are we doing? We doing okay?
Yeah, looks good.
All right, that's good. Jamie, thank you for that introduction, and Jamie and Stella, thank you for inviting me to do this. By way of a little bit of background, either with Mike Colin or Wan Chan Lee or several others for the past 25 years, I've been teaching equating, scaling, and linking along with a few other things, both in a formal environment such as the University of Iowa Measurement Program, which Jamie and Stella have sat through more than once, or in pre-sessions at NCME and other places around the country, sometimes around the world. So it's not the case that this is my first rodeo, but it is the case it's my first rodeo without being able to interact directly with participants. So that will change it for me and undoubtedly a bit for you. But I will try to do the best I can to give you an overview with respect to equating and a little bit of an overview for the rest of the sessions in this NCME session. So I'm going to give you an introduction to equating mainly. I'm going to start off by dedicating this to Bill Engoff, who is a friend of mine as well as the author of a chapter in 1971 in the 2nd edition of Educational Measurement, which was for its time absolutely remarkable. And it has set the stage for just about everything that has subsequently been done in equating, linking, and scaling, in my opinion. I think Bill, he was a very reserved man, but he does not get nearly the amount of credit that he probably deserves for in his introduction to a number of these issues and the really skillful way he presented them. So scaling and linking and equating, the kind of big picture, these three topics. Scaling involves the assignment of raw scores to user-defined scale scores. We typically categorize it into two types: horizontal scaling, which is the context for typical scaling. So the scaling of raw scores to scale scores of the ACT assessment with its 1 to 36 scale scores. That's one example. The College Board SAT, scaling of raw scores to 200 to 800 in units of 10. That's another well-known example. But also there is vertical scaling, which is used in large part to measure growth. Mike and I talk about that and just about all of these topics in our the 3 editions of our book on equating, scaling, and linking. Vertical scaling, in my opinion, is kind of the toughest problem in psychometrics. Tough because not necessarily the mathematics is tough, but conceptually it's incredibly demanding. And to do it well so that the scores are well interpreted is a really tough job. Linking is a different animal. Linking establishes relationships that are bidirectional between scale scores for 2 or more tests. The crucial issue is the word bidirectional. So this is not prediction. You can go from test A to test B to test A, but it is not prediction. Equating puts scores for 2 or more forms of the same test on a common scale. Crucial issue: forms of the same test on a common scale. It's a very specific type of linking, so it too is bidirectional. There is a kind of logical ordering to these things, I think. We can't do much of anything until first we do scaling. So in that sense, scaling kind of comes first. And then linking is an overarching term. Equating is one type of linking. And in fact, I tried to reflect that when I was editing the 4th edition of Ed Measurement by putting Colin's chapter on scaling just before the Holland and Duran chapter on linking. And they, in their chapter on linking, subsumed the issues of equating within that chapter. While that's logical, pedagogically, it doesn't work very well, because scaling in a certain sense is such a different animal and a much tougher animal in many respects. It's hard to start there. So generally speaking, I tend to view teaching these things in the steps of equating first, scaling second, linking third, which is more or less reflected in the Colin and Brennan book published in 2014. The topics that we're going to consider here, primarily equating. I'll talk about the purpose and context of equating, a little bit about why equating is needed, equating uses, alternatives, and process, and critical issues, of which there are, in my opinion, 3. Equating designs, 3 of them that we'll talk about, equating properties, and methodology. Now, I will spend most of my time talking about these 3 issues, the different types of designs. I will give you a kind of introduction to equating properties, which will be helpful to you if you listen to Wanchan's session the next time, because he will kind of start out from that point, or at least involve those issues in his discussion. Methodology will be covered in future sessions. So there's classical methodology, IRT methodology, among others, and things like that, various different methodologies. It is unfortunate, I think, that most of the time when people think about equating and talk about it, they are actually just talking about methodology. And I think that's a bad mistake. It's very important to consider the designs, especially first, and the equating properties that you're interested in before you start worrying about methodology. If you only know methodology, you don't know much about equating. At least I would claim that to be the case. Purpose and context of equating. What's the purpose? to make a statistical transformation of test scores that adjust for differences in difficulty among test forms such that the forms can be used interchangeably. So let's parse this out. Statistical transformation of test scores. Usually, as you'll see, what we do is we work with raw scores first, and then we convert them to scale scores. We're always adjusting for differences in difficulty among the test forms. Now, that doesn't mean difficulty in the sense of overall difficulty. It means difficulty throughout the regions of the score scale. And the goal ultimately is that the forms should be able to be used interchangeably. In fact, if we do the job well, it should be entirely a matter of indifference to each and every examinee which form of a test he or she takes. Now, we never get to that degree of perfection, but that's the goal. And if we do certain things, we can enhance the likelihood that we get closer and closer to that goal. It is very important to understand that for this to work, the forms have to be developed according to the same content and statistical specifications, both content and statistical. It's very common these days for people to talk in such a way that clearly they're paying attention to statistical specifications, but they tend not to talk so much about content specifications. And I think that's kind of unfortunate, which leads me to another. I'll make a series of offhand comments that you may or may not agree with, but I'll offer them for what you think. I think when I got into the field of equating, scaling, linking, there was a fairly close relationship between the people who worked in equating and the people who worked in test development. I worked on a regular basis, for example, when I was at ACT, directly with Cindy Spicer, who was responsible for all test development, and I was responsible for psychometric issues. That's become less and less true now, not everywhere, but in many cases. So there's a tendency for people who are the test developers not to know much about equating, and for people who know a lot about equating not to necessarily know a lot about test development. And that's kind of unfortunate, because in the end, this is not going to work unless we're dealing with test forms that are measuring the same content and the same statistical specifications. Equating is needed because it's impossible to develop forms that are precisely equal in difficulty throughout the score scale range. If we could do that, if test developers could do that, then we could all be without a job. In fact, when I teach, I often say that the real goal is that we should all of us who do equating, we should be able to be fired. You can fire us if, in fact, you can develop tests that are truly measuring the same thing throughout the higher score scale. Trouble is, of course, realistically, we can't ever get to that. So what's the context? The context is we start out with a raw to scale to a conversion table for some initial form. Now, that initial form will have raw scores and will act as if these raw scores are number correct scores for purposes today. They aren't always that, but that's good enough for today. Then we have to do an initial scaling. That gets to the conversion table. Once you do that, subsequent forms are going to always link back to that original form in its conversion table. So that original conversion table turns out to play an oversized role in a sense, especially if you're developing a new testing program where you don't really know necessarily what's going on, at least empirically, too much, but you've still got to establish a score scale initially. And sometimes that score scale perhaps isn't as good as you would like, as you find out 2 or 3 years down the road. And I will often tell people it's really reasonable to reconsider reestablishing a score scale several years out. In fact, one of the problems with a lot of the score scales that do exist is that they tend to persist far too long, I think. Not all of them, but an awful lot of them do persist far too long. So that's the first thing, the conversion table. And then there are going to be some equating computations for a new form, and they are performed with raw scores. This isn't quite true if we were talking about IRT, but in future sessions, people will talk about IRT methodology, and you'll see what I mean when I say it isn't quite true. The resulting equated raw scores for the new form are then transformed to the scale scores using the conversion table. And I'm going to give you an example of this setup in a couple of minutes, few minutes. The important point from this slide, if there is one single most important point, it's this: equating adjusts for differences in difficulty, not content. Not content. The equating methodologies cannot in any way adjust for content differences. So it's imperative that test developers develop forms that are as equivalent as possible with respect to the content tested. Why is equating needed? Well, perhaps this example will help a little bit. Suppose we have a testing program that has two test dates, February and July. What are the potential problems if the same form is used on both test dates? This is usually pretty obvious. If the same form is used in both test dates, first of all, if an examinee decides to retest, he or she will have seen those items before the second time he or she tests. And secondly, even if he or she doesn't retest, probably he or she talks to a friend of theirs and tells them about some of the items that are on the test. There's nothing terribly wrong with that. There's nothing illegal about doing that. But in doing so, of course, that other person, if he or she takes the test in July, has some prior knowledge about which items are on the test. So in that sense, there's a degree of lack of item security if you use the same form, because the July scores then might well be higher than the February scores, not because the form is easier, but rather simply because the forms are not very secure, or more specifically, some items are known. Now, that is clearly, I think, an undeniable potential problem. Sometimes I think it gets exaggerated. The truth is, in most testing contexts, in some sense, there are items that are re-administered in different forms. If only because you have to administer items in order to get pretest statistics to decide if they're any good. Once you've decided whether or not if they're any good, then you will use them again later on. So it's a bit of an exaggeration to say we never have items that are administered only once. They're typically administered a couple of times anyway, somehow or other, just that you don't know where or when. What are the potential problems if different forms are used on both test dates? Well, if different forms are used on both test dates, in some sense, and the examinees who test with the easier form will be advantaged if you don't do anything about it. That is, if you presume at the outset that you've got two forms and one of them is easier than the other, then all of the things being equal, examiners who test with that easier form should score higher. So that's a potential problem. But since both the forms and the test dates are different, form and group differences are confounded. That is, we don't know, if we just look at data, whether to attribute differences, such as means, to the forms being differentially difficult or the groups being differentially able. Now, that is a very central issue to equating. That is, we're always dealing with a context in which there is a potential confounding of form difficulty and group ability. And in a sense, the processes involved in doing equating are intended to disconfound those differences. That's kind of the overall ultimate goal. And the various methodologies may do it entirely differently, but ultimately, the ultimate goal is the same. Equating use and alternatives. When do we use equating? Well, we use it when alternate forms exist, as I was talking about before, and when all of the examinees are evaluated relative to the same standard. Now, sometimes I think people don't quite understand what I mean by that. Obviously, if it were just as simple as a passing score, then the passing score on the two forms would be the same standard. In many cases, equating is conducted with tests in which all or most of the score scales are going to carry some meaning that in fact is the basis for decision making. The ultimate point is that the scale score in Form X of, say, Z should have the same meaning as the scales as that Z does on Form Y, somehow or other. That's the ultimate goal. Well, what are the alternatives? Raw scores, I've talked about that on the previous slide a bit to illustrate some of the problems with just taking raw scores and using them. A second alternative on the surface may seem like it's a pretty good idea within test state scaling. So what you could do if you had two forms, X and Y, one administered in February and one administered in July, you could scale each of them separately. That is, each of them with the examinees who tested in February and with the examinees who tested in July. Well, why not do this? Well, the problem is if you do this, you can, for example, guarantee that the means would be the same, the standard deviations would be the same. You could guarantee that to be the case for the particular groups of examinees who tested on the two test states. But almost always the groups who test on different test states are different and very often substantially different. In fact, I don't know of any testing program offhand where anyone who knows it well would want to make a claim that examinees who test on the different test states are indeed comparable. If they were, then within test state scaling would be okay. But I don't know of any testing program in which someone would be willing to do that. Third alternative may sound even more ridiculous. No equating. Is this a ridiculous alternative? When I'm teaching a course and I have face-to-face interaction with students, this is a fun issue to talk about. We can't do that here. Is this a ridiculous alternative? Well, it may sound so on the surface, and often it is, but there is some circumstances in which it is not ridiculous. What do I mean by that? Well, equating involves methodology. Methodologies make assumptions, and methodologies to apply them always require data. Suppose the assumptions of a methodology are clearly not correct, and/or suppose that the data available to you is clearly not very good. In that case, it may actually be reasonable to not do any equating. I mean, the most common case in which this tends to occur is early on in a testing program, where the second or third time the testing program is used, there are very few examinees, and you have fairly good reason to believe that they are probably not going to be examinees who will be typical of those who test later. And in that case, it may actually be better to do no equating. Now, someone will typically at this point ask me, well, have I ever actually used that alternative? And the answer is yes, I have. There have been situations in which I've been responsible for equating, and I decided that it was better not to do equating and rely on the skill of the test developers to create comparable forms than it was to rely on very likely questionable data and very likely questionable assumptions. So it's rare that this happens, but it's worthwhile to think about it and to recognize that it always is an alternative. Ultimately, the goal is that reported scores on the various forms should mean the same thing to the extent that we are possible to do so. The equating scaling process is kind of a big two-step process. First and foremost, we establish a scale on the first form, and then equating maintains the score scale for the future forms. And it's very useful to think about equating from that point of view. That is, the purpose of equating is to maintain the meaning of a score scale over forms and time. So here's a hypothetical example to give you a sense of how this plays out. We have a hypothetical conversion table for test forms. I should have said tables for test forms. Y is an old form. X1 and X2 are new forms. Now, I'm going to say this a couple of times. This is purely a convention. By convention, Mike Colin and I, in the 3 editions of our book, we used Y to indicate an old form, and we used X to indicate new forms, and the subscript, and then we use subscripts, and we have to be very careful about them, and I'll show you what I mean by that later on. But right now, we're going to say we have 2 new forms, X1 and X2. And I'll clarify notational issues in a moment. So let's suppose we've done some scaling with this initial form, and the net result is that these raw scores, that is number correct scores, got assigned to the following scale scores. So 26, a raw score of 26 gets a scale score of 13, 27 gets a scale score of 14, 29 and 30 get scale score of 15. Now, we develop a new form X1, and the raw scores that correspond to the scale scores over here are listed here. So I want you to think about it this way. We actually do an equating in which this new form X1 is equated to the original form Y with respect to raw scores. And when we do that, a 28 on X1 turns out to be equivalent to a 27 on Y. Similarly, a 30 on X1 equivalent to a 29 on Y. But if you look at these numbers and these numbers, it's pretty clear. These are all 1 point higher. So that means that this new form is 1 point easier than this original form. Okay. So what does equating do? It says a 28 on this new form X1 is equivalent to a 27 on Y. And then that 27 is itself converted to a scale score of 14. So that means a 28 on X1 should be assigned a scale score of 14 on the original scale. Okay. Now let's go one step further and say, okay, we develop a second new form, X2. And let's suppose we equate it initially to X1. Well, then it turns out a 29 is equivalent to a 28. And you can see these numbers are all 1 point higher than these numbers. So this form X2 is easier than X1. And we can get back to the score scale through a transitive operation. 29 is associated with a 28 on X1. 28 is associated with 27 on Y. And that's associated with a 14 as a scale score. So a 29 raw score on X2 is assigned a scale score of 14 on the original form. Now, I talked about doing the equating of X2 to X1 and then making use of the rest of this table. I could have done the equating differently. That is, I could have equated X2 to Y directly. You'd have to have a design to accommodate that, but it could have been done directly. And if I did, then this 29 would get directly associated to a 27 here. And since 27 is associated with a 14, the 14, 29 items correct, gets associated with 14 on X2. So that's kind of a rough idea of the equating scaling process, how the whole thing tends to work out. In practice, after you've done this a while, you worry about the equating of this to this, and then the last step you do is transform back to the scale scores. Now, there's one other point I introduced into this table to bring up another topic, and that is many-to-one conversions. In many contexts, the scale that's used may have fewer scale score points than the raw scores that are available. And when that happens, you're going to have situations in which 2 or more raw score points convert to the same scale score. That's called a many to one conversion. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but obviously you lose some amount of precision. As a common example of that, at the ACT assessment, Mike Colin and I were responsible for the equating and scaling of the ACT assessment for a couple of decades. And there, the ACT assessment scale scores are 1 to 36. And for each of the tests, there are more than 36 items. And so there are many to one conversions in the ACT assessment score scale. The SAT reverses the issue. The SAT has many more scale score points, 200 to 800, than it does raw scores for any test. Now, the College Board got around that a little bit by, after a while, instead of reporting 240, 241, 242, they just reported 240, 250, 260. They did it in units of 10. But still, there are many cases, or some cases, in which there are several raw scores converting to the same scale score. And in fact, there are other cases in which there are gaps in the scale score range. If you're responsible for actually doing equating, you worry a lot about that last issue. What do you do with respect to gaps, and what do you do about with respect to many to one conversions? That's kind of beyond the scope of what we'll cover here, but I just wanted to mention those kinds of issues that do arise in practice. Now we're coming to what is kind of the heart of the discussion for today. That is the critical issues and choices in equating, and in particular, the first two. The first is data collection design. The second is definitions of properties of equating. Third, statistical methodology, which is what most people tend to think about when they hear the word equating, unfortunately, because equating is much more than just methodology. So I'm going to focus on these two, especially the first one. 2 and 3 are somewhat intertwined. I can't get into that because you haven't learned about the methodology yet, but it is the case that they're somewhat intertwined. I do want to make a couple of statements, though. Typically, methodology cannot fully overcome flaws or designs in the challenges in the data collection design. That's why, for me, design issues almost supersede all else. So, for example, I've been known to say on many occasions that if you ask me what I would like first and foremost, if I'm doing equating, the first thing I would like to have is a random groups design, because that solves a lot of problems right off the top, but it won't be obvious to you why that's the case yet. I'll try to make it obvious to you in a while. But understanding data collection designs and their impact on equating is really crucial. So some notational conventions, and these are the same conventions that Mike and I used in the 3 editions of our book. Now this is there's a slight difference between this and the previous. This layout here, I used 1 and 2 to differentiate the 2 new forms. Okay, now I'm going to use 1 and 2, where 1 is associated with a new form and 2 is associated with an original form or an anchor form. People call it various things, or an old form. So don't ask why this is true, because it isn't absolutely true. It's purely convention. Associate new, X, and 1 together. Associate old, Y, and 2 together. And if you keep that in your mind, then the equations that you see in here, and probably likely in other sessions that will come up, and then Colin and Brennan, you'll be okay. But students often get confused if they fail to recognize that. X sub 1 go together. Y sub 2 go together. Y is the old form. Sometimes old means original form on which the scale was established. Sometimes Y means just it's an older form than form X. The context makes clear what the issue is. So at the risk of being thoroughly redundant, X goes with 1, Y goes with 2. Random groups design. As I said, all things considered, if I can have only one thing, if I'm going into an equating situation and someone were able to tell me you can have one and only one thing, guaranteed as the outset, the one and only one thing I'd want is a random groups design. Now, what do we mean by that? A random groups design is a design in which a new form X and an older form Y, possibly the original form, are administered to different subgroups, and the subgroups are random. And typically, these randomly equivalent groups are obtained through spiraling. In principle, they could be obtained through an actual random assignment of random numbers. In practice, not likely to be done that way. There are just too many ways it could get screwed up by people in the field. What is typically done is, let's suppose we've got two forms, an old form Y, a new form X. If you think about a few thousand of those forms being printed up, and we won't deal with computerized testing right this minute, and you pick off a form Y, and then you stack onto it a form X, and then put a form Y, and then you put a form X, and that's spiral. Keep on doing that for as many forms as you've got. And then if you've got 5 test centers, you take a fifth of them and you send them off to the one test center, another fifth to a second test center, et cetera. And then the people in the test centers, they hand out the booklets to the students or examinees as they are seated in the room. That's called spiraling. Now, it is pretty much foolproof, but not completely. I'll give you a favorite example. When Mike Cullen and I were equating the ACT assessment in the 1990s, there was a very conscientious test center administrator who got these packets, and typically these the XY forms are put in packets of like 20 or 30 or 40. She got those packets and she noticed that the packets had AB or maybe ABC, but they weren't all the same. So she said, okay, they screwed it up. So she took apart the packages and put all the X's together, and then she put all the Y's together, et cetera. And then went into one classroom and gave them all X's, and the second classroom gave them all X's until she ran out, and then she gave them Y's. The net effect of that was to completely destroy the random assignment of forms to kids, unless you can conceive of a situation in which the students sat in chairs such that the random assignment would still be justified. Clearly not the case. So spiraling, it is possible to defeat spiraling. In practice, if you do equating and you're responsible for equating, one of the first things you do when you get back data is to do some analyses to make sure that the spiraling worked, even if it's only as simple as getting mean scores. And if you notice places in which the spiraling didn't work, you discard those data for the purpose of doing the equating. It's much better to discard questionable data than to just keep it because the sample size would be bigger. The net effect is that you want randomly equivalent groups. And in that case, you've got each examinee taking only one form. And this process can be used not with just 2 forms, but with as many forms as you want. In fact, most of the time it's used with many forms. The last time I was involved in equating, I believe there were 18 new forms of a particular testing program. We'll talk more about numbers in a while. There is a potential security problem here because the very act of conducting equating is essentially a kind of experiment in which multiple new forms get exposed, at least for a small sample of examinees. But since they are exposed, there is a potential of some items from those exposed forms getting known. And, ultimately, when equating is done, each of the forms individually will become a primary form on some particular later test state. So there is a potential problem. So you have to be careful to maintain security when you do random groups, a random groups designed for equating. I would think at this point it would be rather obvious that large sample sizes will be required, not because you have to have terribly large sample sizes for any individual form, but because you are typically going to be doing an equating experiment in which you've got one old form or anchor form and multiple new forms. And so if you need 3,000 examinees per form to do equating, and you've got 5 new forms, you need 15,000 examinees. So in that sense, it requires large sample sizes. But that's the basic idea of an equating design. Now, I would kind of hope that you would be able to intuitively know at this stage of the game why this is an advantage. The advantage is, if I have a randomly equivalent groups design, whatever form differences I note are in fact form differences they can't attributable to groups. So if I've got X and Y and I've got a randomly equivalent groups design, and the mean for X happens to be 25 and the mean for Y happens to be 28, that difference isn't attributable to the groups being different if the spiraling has worked. It's attributable to the forms being different. So all of a sudden, the design gets me out of the perpetual bind of differences being attributable to either forms or to groups. If I've got randomly equivalent groups design, the differences are all attributable to form differences. That makes life a lot easier. An example is the old ACT assessment. And I will use the old SAT as well as an example, and I'm doing it purposefully so that no one can try to guess what things might be like with these assessment programs in today's environment. I think I know, but I'm not going to make that part of this discussion. It's a college admissions test. Back in the 90s, there were 6 test dates each year. Examinees testing on different test states are considered for admission at about the same time, typically. These days, that may not be quite so true. Those days was pretty close to being true. Different test forms are given on different test dates. Now, I want to make sure you understand something. There's an equating design which results in raw to scale score conversion equations. That's different from the fact that any of the new forms are going to be administered to just about all of the examinees on some specific future test date. So any form shows up twice. It shows up in the equating experiment, and it shows up when it's used operationally. That's what I mean when I say different test forms are given on different test dates. In the equating design, of course, the multiple forms and an anchor form, a previously equated form, would be given to examinees all within that equating design. So in the equating design, we would randomly assign one old form and 5 or more new forms. The old form had to be previously equated almost by definition. That's what old means. And sometimes we would use 2 old forms. Typically, what you would do is you would use one old form that's relatively recent, maybe a year or 2 ago, and another old form that's perhaps 4 or 5 years old. And the reason for doing that is to see whether or not your score skill is maintaining stability over time. And generally speaking, if you do that, what you notice is that as the time gets greater, the stability of the score skill deteriorates. And there's a point at which that suggests you should really do a rescaling. Generally speaking, I advise people, and I almost never take my advice, but I advise them that sometime within the first 5 or 10 years after you've introduced a scale, be a good idea to look at whether or not there's a justification for rescaling. Score scales tend to be very difficult to convince decision makers to rescale tests. They really don't like doing that. But the problem is, if you don't do it, you don't have a terribly good rationale for having a lot of confidence in linking back to very much older forms. A second alternative for equating is a single group design with counterbalancing. And this on the surface sounds very good. Turns out to be usually somewhat problematic. But here's the idea. You randomly create two subgroups, 1 and 2. And the first subgroup takes form X and then form Y. The second subgroup takes form Y and then form X. This looks pretty good. Everybody has taken both forms, so the examinees are the same in both subgroups. The only difference is Y follows X or X follows Y. This is called a single group design with counterbalancing. Each examinee takes 2 forms. By the way, this means you can't do it in an operational setting because you'd have some examinees requiring double time and others examinees requiring only single length time, and that will not work well. The forms are separately timed. It clearly involves double the amount of testing time relative for examinees relative to what an examinee would experience in the random group design. Counterbalance is usually employed with this single group design, and it may reveal differential order effects. So we're going to take a look at that in just a moment. But that's the basic idea of the design. On the surface, it seems like a great design, but it tends to have problems. And here's an example. Suppose we've got subgroup 1, subgroup 2, they're both random subgroups. And for this subgroup, I took X followed by Y, and the mean for X is 72, the mean for Y was 75. For subgroup 2, it's form Y first, followed by X, and the mean for Y in the first position is 77, mean for X is 71. So, if I look at the form taken first data, it looks as if form Y is 5 points easier than form X. That's for the form taken first data. If I look at the form taken second data, form Y appears to be 4 points easier than form X. That's what these two statements are saying. So you've got conflicting information. One ordering says Y is easier by 5 points. Another ordering says Y is easier by 4 points. If I combine both groups, it should be kind of obvious that Y will be easier by 4.5 points, kind of averaging out the difference. But the problem is the data you really have suggests that order really matters. That is, there's a differential order effect. Does that matter for our purposes here? Well, it probably does, because in practice, operationally, no examinee is going to take 2 forms, except in an equating experiment. They're going to take one form or another form. They're going to take X or Y. So that suggests that maybe the data we should really rely upon is just the form taken first. Obviously, though, if we do that, we're only using half of the available data, and that's going to have the effect of decreasing error over what it otherwise. That's going to take the effect of increasing certain types of equating error over what it otherwise would be. You kind of wasted the form taken second data. So in practice, although this appears to be good on the surface, doesn't turn out that it typically is good on the surface. It is good in practice. And I'll give you an example of that. This is from the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. And in the mid-1970s, problems arose with that particular testing program using the single group design with counterbalancing. And I should say at the outset, ASVAB is not that well known as a testing program, but in my opinion, it really is a very sound testing program, generally speaking. But this was an unusual circumstance. They were trying to make changes in the testing program. And remember, this is the mid-1970s. And examinees were told that they were going to take two forms, an old and a new form. But it didn't appear to the people making decisions that they could tell these examinees that your decisions will be based upon your new form results, because it was a new form and potentially they hadn't had the opportunity to study different content. So the examinees were told that decisions would be based on old form results. It happened, however, that the old form was distinguishable from the new form. Now, I know many of you weren't even probably born in 1976, but I was more than born. I've been around for a while. Back in those days, when you created a new form, the way you duplicated it was using mimeograph machines. And a mimeographed version of something never looked like a fully typed version. It was very distinguishable. And that was the kind of thing that happened. So think about the examinees. They're knowing that I'm going to take two forms. I don't know which is old and which is new according to what they'll tell me, but I know I'm going to actually be evaluated in terms of the old form, and I know that the mimeograph form must be the new form. So what do? Well, I pay a lot of attention to the old form, which looks cleaner than the new form. And so I'll just score higher on the old form than the new form. And that will make the new form appear to be more difficult than it actually was. And the net effect of that is that the new form equated scores turned out to be inflated. Now, actually, you probably shouldn't even say equated. You probably should say scaled. But the scores turned out to be inflated for subsequent examinees. So all of a sudden, the services found out they were admitting a whole lot of candidates into the services, much more so than previous years using this new form. In fact, it turned out that 350,000 candidates were admitted to the military incorrectly because of these context effects brought about by using the single group design with counterbalancing when the situation was such that the old form was clearly distinguishable from the new form. So the bottom line is context effects matter and methodology cannot correct for them. And this has long been a mantra of mine to say context effects really matter. Okay. I think what I'm going to do is take a 5-minute break. And the 5 minutes mainly is just to relax my voice and for no other reason. So I've got 2:54 by my time. So 2:59 or 3 o'clock my time. We'll come back and then I'll start talking about the common item non-equivalent groups design. Okay, there's no reason to shut down anything, I don't think, just take about 5 minutes, no more than 5 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, you can. You can
Okay,
start.
I think we're on. Okay, the third equating design, the first one being random groups, the second one being a single group with counterbalancing usually. Third, common item non-equivalent groups design. Sometimes it's called a NEAT design, especially by Paul Holland and Neil Duran's NEAT standing for non-equivalent anchor test design. I will probably refer to it as the common item design, just simply. Here's the situation. I should tell you at the outset, at least these days, so far as I know, by far, this is the most frequently used design, or some variety of it is the most frequently used design, and there are many varieties of it. The situation is this. We have a new form X. We have an old form Y. We administer the new form X to one particular group, 1, and the old form Y to a different group, 2. So the forms are different and the groups are different. So going back to the original example I used, the February, July example or a testing program, there the dates are different. So presumably the groups are different too, and the forms were different. So what are we going to do? If we just take a look at mean differences overall, those mean differences, the mean difference for X, and the mean difference for Y, they're going to involve some amount of group differences and some amount of form differences. How are we going to get out of that bind? We get out of that bind, or attempt to, by embedding some set of common items. That is, items in X that also appear in Y. And generally speaking, what's going on is the performance on the common items tells us directly how different, or seemingly directly, how different the groups are, and what's left over must be attributable to forms. That's the basic idea. Some of the characteristics. On any particular test date, only one form is administered. That's what makes it so appealing to so many people. But groups testing on different dates are not equivalent. There are 2 ways we can deal with this design. One is internal, one is external. Internal means that the common items are embedded within the tests and they contribute to reported scores for the examinee. So there are 2 things, not just that they are internal to the tests, but also that the scores on those common items contribute to examinee scores, just as the other items do. An external set of common items is typically separately timed one or more sets of common items. And these separately timed external common items do not directly contribute to examinee scores on the test in question. Indirectly, they do, but not directly. The common items are used to disentangle form and group differences. And as such, their value depends very, very much on the extent to which they represent both the content and statistical specifications used for the entire test. If that is not true, then you have reason to be very suspicious about how good the equating will be. So that is a crucial point. If you don't pay attention to content, you're going to be in trouble. If you don't pay attention to statistical specifications, you're going to be in trouble. When content people are disassociated with psychometric people, the importance of the content similarity issue can get overlooked, or at least to some extent. That's one of the things that always bothers me. The advantages are pretty clear. Only new data required is data for a single new form. That's associated with this. Only one form administered per test date. And for the external case, in which these external items are separately timed, the operational items can actually be disclosed. A bit of background on that. Back in the 80s, there was legislation passed by New York State that essentially required every testing program to release all of the items for any form of their test administered within the state of New York right after they were administered. Roughly speaking, that was the idea. If the items contributed to the examinee score. Well, if you used an external set of common items, in one sense, you could say the external common items did not contribute to the examinee score. And they did contribute, however, to the actual scale scores. But that was one of the arguments that was being flown around in New York State at the time, New York State testing legislation, about what was going to happen. That may sound a bit obscure. It should sound somewhat obscure, but I can assure you that it had a tremendous impact on the field of measurement at the time. Because what testing companies feared is that they would have to develop so many more items and forms. The net effect would be that they could easily go out of business. Now, it turned out that actually, in a sense, I think it probably advantaged testing companies. It gave them a rationale for doing things that were pretty expensive and then passing costs on to others in the process. But at the time, it was truly a very debatable issue. One thing to remember is that this design requires strong assumptions, namely these. Both content and statistical specifications must represent the full-length test. There's no psychometric free lunch here. That is, there's no methodology that's going to be clever enough so that it overcomes this requirement. And generally speaking, the methodologies to deal with equating in this context are more complex than the methodologies to deal with random group design. Here's an example. Suppose we've got two forms of a hypothetical one-item test with an internal set of 20 common items. Internal, again, means yes, they're within the test, but they are part of the examinee's score that's used for equating. Got two groups. Group one takes form X, group two takes form Y, and we observe means for group X on group. For group one on X, for group two on Y, 72 and 77. We've also got within those forms a set of common items. Group one gets 13 on average of those common items correct, or 65% of 100. Group two gets 15 of those common items correct, or 75% of 100. So let's think this through. Does this information allow us to draw a conclusion about which form is easier? Well, if you think about this, the common items, if they represent the full-length test faithfully, are clearly the same for group one and two. And so any differences here are attributable to groups. So it appears as if group two is more able than group one by about 10 percentage points. Or in this case, since it's a 100-item test, by 10 items. If that's true, then, see if I can do the writing right. It should be clear to you that this blank here must be 67, which is 10 points lower than 77. And this blank here must be 82, which is 10 points higher than 72. All right, now we've used these common items to guess what these blank entries are. And if our guesses are correct, then it suggests that form X is easier than form Y by about 5 points. And we get the same information whether we use group one or whether we use group two. All right. Given the information I've provided, that's probably the best you could do. But, and in that sense, it's the obvious answer, but this obvious answer makes assumptions about the methodology used. And even if we take simple methods such as linear methods, depending upon what the assumptions are, the entries in these cells can be quite different. Every methodology you employ is going to make assumptions. Assumptions have consequences. Consequences will change these numbers. If I were teaching the classical method section that Wanchan will be teaching next, I believe, he might not, but I might choose to take a look at this example again and see what the results are with different sets of assumptions. There are different ways to teach that, but that's the idea. The basic idea throughout, remember, is when the differences between the two means for X in group 1, Y in group 2 is attributable to a mean form group difference and a mean form difference. We got to split this out. We can't do so directly. We split this out using the common items. Here's another example. Percent correct for two groups on a hypothetical test. And this time we're looking at content areas. Content areas 1 and 2. You want to be specific. Suppose it was addition and subtraction. Group 1 gets 70% of 1 correct, 80% of 2. Group 2 gets 80% of 1 correct and 70% of 2. So these percentages are shifted, or twisted, interchanged. For the total test, however, if I weight content 1 and content 2 equally, then we would expect on average that group 1 would get 75% correct. Group 2 would get 75% correct. Okay, that much seems pretty clean. Suppose, however, that when you construct the common item set, instead of having half of the items be from content 1 and content 2, you had 3/4 of the items be from content 1 and 1/4 from content 2. If that's the case, then using these percents and these weights, we get 72.5%. Using these same weights and these different percents, we get 77.5%. In other words, when the common items do not represent the full-length test faithfully, it appears as if group 2 is substantially more able than group 1 on the total test. That is obviously, I hope obviously, a problem. Because if I use a common item set that is constructed this way, it will not represent the full-length test faithfully. And so any conclusions about group differences will be biased, wrong. And when I look at the overall difference, maybe this, if this is wrong, then so will this be wrong. Because I've got the same difference being split into two parts. So if this part's wrong, this is going to be wrong as well. The net effect will be that equating will not work well. There is not a lot of literature, but certainly enough literature to demonstrate that this indeed does happen if the common item sets do not represent the full-length test faithfully. Unfortunately, a great deal of the published literature is not specific enough to be able to read it and even make a reasoned decision about this issue. But there is some where it is. This tends to be hidden. One of my biggest complaints about most of the current literature and measurement is that it does not provide enough details to actually look at this directly. And so you've got to trust that the results that are being reported, in fact, are defensible. So this is a common item non-equivalent groups design, the most frequently used design. An example with an external set of common items is the old SAT, old up until maybe a decade ago, give or take. It's a college admissions test. It was administered 7 test dates per year, different forms on each test date, nothing particularly novel there. Among the things were novel, there are 4 sets of separately timed external common item sets. The common item sections were hidden from examinees in old and new forms in a certain way. They were randomly assigned to examinees. Now, the fact that they were hidden, you may say, well, how is that possible since they were separately timed? Well, if an operational section and a common item section were about the same length, so you couldn't tell from length which was operational, which was external. The 4 sets were used to link back to different populations. So typically you'd link back to a very recent population, and one of them may be much older, and then there'll be other 2 in between. I think that design was probably the strongest common item design I've ever seen used in practice. It was used for a long time with the SAT. It was extraordinarily expensive, however, to both create forms and do all the details necessary for that entire process to give you the data you needed. The actual computations weren't that much more difficult. You had to do them 4 times rather than 2 times, but it was the test development that was very expensive. Another example of common item context effects is the NAEP reading anomaly, which was discovered in the 1980s. NAEP, as I'm sure you all know, is the National Assessment for Educational Achievement. It's a survey of students in grades 4, 8, and 12. And various times they used to do the surveying relative to age rather than grades, but we'll talk about it at this point with respect to 4, 8, and 12. A distinguishing feature is that no individual scores are given. And one of the reasons I think NAEP has survived is because it doesn't give individual scores. Without giving individual scores, it doesn't become such a political animal. Only group scores are reported. Of course, as the groups on which scores are reported get smaller and smaller, it tends to assume more and more importance. Tests have objectively scored items, some of which do involve judges, but they're still objectively scored. It's a common item design essentially with internal common items. The methodology used is quite complicated, but the basic design is a common item design with internal items. What happened in the mid-1980s was that the reading assessment showed a surprisingly large score scale decrease. And the feds and the people who worked with them at that time were shrewd enough not to release the scores when they noticed those differences until they tried to figure out what the cause of those differences were. And it turned out the explanation was the manner in which common items were used in linking. So without giving you all of the details, I'll give you a kind of idea of it. In 1984, there were booklets, separate booklets for reading and writing. But in 1986, for ages 9 and 13, the booklets were in reading, math, and/or science. And then for age 17, the booklets were in reading, computer science, history, and/or literature. So we're interested in, let's just focus on reading. We're interested in reading. Okay, from grades 9 and 13, reading occurs along with booklets in math and/or science, not with a writing booklet. And for grade 17, reading occurs along with booklets in computer science, history, and/or literature. So the things surrounding reading weren't the same. So obviously common items surrounding reading weren't the same. Furthermore, the common items had different orders from 84 to 86 and different amounts of time to complete. So even if you assume, which I think is a fair assumption, that the common items, there were as many of them as were necessary to do equating from 84 to 86. What happened was that in 1984, the manner in which those common item data were collected was different from what it turned out to be in 1986. This, I think, is a classic example of clearly the test development teams did not pay attention, did not talk to the psychometric teams. They went ahead and did what they thought made sense for an improved assessment. I'm sure they intended to be an improvement, but improvement means change, and change works against good equating typically. And these were very substantial changes. So in short, the context of the common reading items was indeed quite different from 84 to 86. And it resulted in a very noticeable, very large score decrease. So much so that the 86 data were never judged to be very defensible. Such context effects definitely undermine equating. And the context effects really do matter. So there are two messages from this, for me anyway. One is context effects really matter. That is, you can't just have the same items and you put all the common items at the back rather than at the front. Or you can't do things like that, which change the context. And here, there were many more things than that done. The second is context effects matter. And they really do have substantial consequences. And in this particular case, without knowing the details, I expect these problems arose because there wasn't a good enough communication between test development staff and psychometric staff. Otherwise, I think this would not have happened. That's my guess. I don't know that guess is correct, but I think it is. So the critical issues and choices in equating are three. Equating, pick an equating design, random design, single group design, common item design. Secondly, definitions and properties of equating. Third, statistical psychometric methodology. The last two are somewhat intertwined. In my opinion, methodology cannot overcome flaws or challenges in data collection designs. What I'm going to do now is talk about definitions and properties of equating in a more typically structured instructional context. Probably Wan-Chun Lee would talk about this, but he's got a big job next time when he meets with you because he's got a lot to cover. And covering definitions and properties of equating as well might not be possible. So we discussed it and then decided I would talk about definitions and properties of equating, which helps him out. It gives him more time to talk about classical procedures. So fundamental equating properties, a brief, somewhat simplified treatment. The first property is one that no matter what, you simply can't overlook if you want to have confidence in equating. The test forms must be built to the same content and statistical specifications. Otherwise, regardless of statistical procedures, the scores cannot be used interchangeably. That's virtually a guarantee. I probably should say something more about that in this context. If I dealt with psychology and psychological assessments, which I don't, I know nothing about, still, it might be possible to weaken this statement a bit, because in such context, at least sometimes, there's a construct being tested and the construct itself is pretty unidimensional. And so there are many different subsets of the data that might represent, subsets of the items that might represent the full length test quite well. But in educational testing and licensure and certification, the kinds of things I've dealt with all my career, that's not the case. There's virtually no such thing as an educational test, a licensure test, a certification test that's unidimensional per se. It just isn't. And so the choice of content to represent the full-length test is challenging. And statistical specifications, meeting those, that's challenging too. But choosing content, that's really challenging. If you don't do that, then you wind up with the kinds of crazy conclusions that we had, for example, back here, where the common items don't represent the full-length test faithfully. Symmetry. Symmetry basically means things stay the same whether I go from X to Y or Y to X. And in the context of equating, I don't know of anyone who would argue that it is not definitively required under all circumstances. So the function to transform a score in form X to the scale of form Y must be the inverse of the function to transform a score of form Y to the scale of form X. In other words, whether I equate X to Y and get a result, or Y to X and get a result, if I plot those two, they should be the same. So symmetry implies, for example, that if a score of 26 on form X converts to 27 on form Y, then a score of 27 on form Y converts to a 26 on form X. I mean, this is essentially a kind of tautology which needs to hold for equating to possess the property of symmetry. This requirement in and of itself emphatically rules out regression as an equating method. There are many equations that you'll see in any equating book or reference to equating that look a lot like regression equations, but they aren't regression equations if you look at them very carefully. They are not regression equations. Second property, the observed score equating properties. Let me say a bit about that first. There is something called observed score equating, which pedagogically is the first thing, at least I would teach, and I think it's the first thing Wanchun will teach the next time he meets with you. There are also things called true score equating, and they kind of capture the ballpark in a sense, but then you get into different methodologies where things get, different issues get raised, especially when you get into IRT. But you can think in terms of observed score equating properties and true score equating properties. Here, I'm just going to talk about observed score equating properties. And these are the ones that arise in many testing programs that employ observed score equating. The basic idea is that the characteristics of observed score distributions are set equal for a specified population of examinees. Now you do get to choose which characteristics, and you'll see that in a moment. First of all, we need to introduce some notation. And I kind of apologize to you about this. I'd like to do this without introducing notation, but there is no way to do it and still be able to say things correctly without such statements being incredibly long. So uppercase G is the CDF, cumulative distribution function of Y scores. E sub YX means an equating function that converts form X scores, right there, to the scale of form Y. That is, E sub Y of X means form X equated score. So we have Y scores, and we have form X converted to the scale of Y. That is form X equated scores. G star is the cumulative distribution of these equated scores. So you've got this for Y and a similar thing for X. The equipercentile equating property says that the cumulative distribution function of these equated X scores is the same as the cumulative distribution function of the Y scores. Now, that's perhaps the most common, frequently used equating property, and probably it's associated with probably the most common, frequently used equating procedure, or it was for a long time anyway. It's still fairly demanding because it's basically saying that throughout the score scale range, we can equate X to Y. A simpler, much simpler alternative is to say, well, maybe we can't do it that well, but what we can do is that the equated scores on X and those on Y have the same mean, and that's called mean equating. And we can get a bit more stringent and we can say the equated scores on X and Y will have the same mean and standard deviation, and that is called a linear equating property. So what you will see, I think, next week, I think Wanchan will do it this way, is he will probably begin talking about linear equating in this sense. And then as a special case, I think he will talk about mean equating, because mean equating is very seldom used in practice. It would typically only be used if there were only a small amount of data available to you. And after he's done that, he will probably go into, I'm certainly going to, equipercentile equating, and the equipercentile equating procedures essentially are procedures that are designed to maintain this property. So I said before that properties of equating and equating procedures tend to be linked, intertwined anyway. And this is perhaps the best example I can give you here. Here's the property per se, is this. The equating procedure will have formulas that look a lot like this because they're attempting to achieve this as their goal. That's basically what's going on. So that's the first thing you will see, observed score equating, and most likely, I suspect, Wanchan Li will talk about this during his presentation, probably start off with this one as a simplified version. But that's a very important equating property. It's not the most important. Personally, I think the most important one personally is this one. Same specifications. Now, it would be very difficult to talk about equating properties without saying something about Lewitt's equity property, which is pretty complicated, but it's certainly being discussed and has been being discussed for 35 years, and there's still not a complete understanding or a complete agreement on understanding of it. But I'll try to give you the idea. And I think the simplest way to do it is to do this. Keep this in mind, this equipercentile equating property. And in a sense, this property is a property for the entire distribution. And what equity does, in a sense, is it looks at this kind of thing for each particular true score, but basically the same kind of thing. So, as before, let EQY be the equating function that converts scores on form X to the scale of form Y. Equity is going to hold if for each TAR, each potential true score, the equivalent, the Y equivalent of X and Y itself have a common distribution function. So you can think about it a bit this way. If you think about a distribution of true scores, like this, and I pick one, then I could have a distribution of observed scores at that particular point. And if I do equating at the same point, I've had a distribution of equated scores. Those two distributions should overlap, be isomorphic more than overlap. So basically what this means is that it should be a matter of indifference to each and every examinee whether he or she takes form Y or form X after equating. I don't think there are many people who would disagree that if there is a ideal result, it would be this. It should be a matter of indifference to each and every examinee whether he or she takes form Y or form X after equating. We never achieve that goal perfectly, but that's the ultimate goal. Typically, Lord's equity is discussed in the context of a strong true score model, especially IRT, although I don't think that's the only possibility. I think Lord's beta 4 model, it could also be discussed in the context of Lord's beta 4 model and probably other models. But typically, it's discussed these days in the context of IRT. But the basic idea, I don't think, is inherently tied to IRT. Lord claimed that equity is possible only if form X and Y are essentially identical. Thus, using equating as a criterion, equating is either unnecessary or impossible. And that is a statement from his 1980 book. So what he's saying is, this is an ideal result, but that's either impossible or it's unnecessary. Not everybody agrees with that conclusion these days. At least Wim van der Linden has written a couple of papers in which he's challenging it in various different kinds of ways. But I think most people kind of accept the property itself as an idealized goal that can't be achieved fully in practice, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't get as close as we can. A less demanding thing to consider is first order equity, in which case all we require is that the means for Y and the equated scores are equal given TAR, or to state it differently, for each TAR, or if you want, for each examinee, the mean of Y and the equivalents are equal. Second order equity, same idea, but instead of focusing on the means, you focus on both means and standard deviations. So this is kind of focusing on the first moment, this is kind of focusing on the first two moments, and this is kind of focusing on all moments of the distribution. Lord's equity focuses on all moments of the distribution. Now, I've been pretty loose and cavalier with respect to some highly technical issues in the discussion, but I think you should be able to get the basic idea from what I've said. So going back, the properties, same specifications, that I think is undeniably necessary. Symmetry is undeniably necessary. Observed score equating properties is one alternative if you're focusing on observed score equating. A good one, I think, and perhaps in my opinion is maybe as good as you get. Lord's equity is an idealized property, but a well-intentioned idealized property that I think all of us need to pay attention to because it gives us an idea of what the idealized goal is. It should be a matter of indifference to each and every examinee, which form of a test he or she takes. Methodology is considered in subsequent sections by Wanshan Lee and others. And for now, that's all, folks. There is a list of references that I provided on a single page, book and chapter references that I think are probably define the field pretty well. Lord's Angos full references here. There are some books of readings, such as Von Davia's and Durand's and Pomerock, the Holland and Durand's chapter, as well as Mike Collins' chapter in the 4th edition of there. And the book by Colin and I, the third edition, is just there. So thank you for your attention. I think if I did this the way I intended anyway, I've left some time for questions. Maybe more time than I had anticipated, actually. I thought it would take me a bit longer. But I'll do my best to answer any questions you may have at this point. And I'll turn it back to Jamie or Stella. I'm not sure who's going to field those.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Brennan. That was a great introduction. So the only questions that we had was about distribution of the PowerPoint afterwards. And so I think that'll be shared right after the presentation or after today. Otherwise, there have not been any other chat questions come through. So if anyone else has any questions they'd like to unmute at this time, you can. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, don't be shy. I've taught introductory students all the way to advanced students, so there's no such thing as a dumb question. Maybe a dumb answer, but not a dumb question.
Okay, here, there's a question in the chat box. Regarding the random group design, if it is not the situation for spiraling test forms, how do the testing programs commonly define or assume equivalent groups in practice for equating two different tests?
You have to have some process. If you're going to claim you're going to use an equivalent groups design, you have to have some process of collecting data such that the two groups are judged truly to be equivalent. Now, if you had no such process, but you had background data on examinees, what you might do is find a subset of those two groups that possess similar or the same background characteristics. And then you could do equating with that subgroup. The problem was you'd have to be convinced that that subgroup of examinees who have the same background characteristics really represent the full group of examinees on which you would do the equating. So you wouldn't have an you wouldn't have a priori random groups. You take the groups you've got and you create pseudo random groups through some kind of matching procedure. I've seen that done for sure. It always raises in my mind a degree of skepticism because after the fact matching does not necessarily then give you a group that represents the full length group, the full group. If you did that, then if it were me and I were doing that, I would want to at least state in some formal documentation what was done, and that it raises some doubts about the extent to which the random groups assumption was fulfilled.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple other questions coming in. So the next one is, could you speak a little about the design requirements for IRT? Are they more or less stringent than the ones discussed here, or are they merely different?
That is a very big question. Who is teaching IRT, Jamie?
Yeah, I am.
You are, okay, good. Okay. So Jamie gets a chance to contradict everything I'm about to say later on. I think it is more difficult to do equating with IRT than with the other methods, because it is so flexible in principle. But flexibility has a price. You've got to be able to have confidence that the results really hold up. There's really nothing I've said today, I don't think, that wouldn't apply in general equally well to IRT. The processes would be different, et cetera. But with IRT, you have an additional very big issue. All of the IRT models, and just about all of the IRT models currently used, make a strong unidimensionality assumption. Now, if that assumption were fully and completely true, then it wouldn't be so much of a problem selecting common items, because all of them would be measuring the same thing. But in educational testing these days, that's really not true. And so there's a burden on the person designing how you're going to collect data and do equating to make sure that the common items represent the full length test faithfully. There's one other comment I'll make about that, because I guess I'm old enough now, so I have a kind of historical perspective on this. If you go back to Lewis's 1982 book, which is one of the 5 or 6 best psychometric books I think that have ever been written, if you go back to that book and carefully read it and look at the examples that it uses in IRT, almost all of those examples are for an old version of the SAT, which was constructed to be unidimensional in a factor analytic sense. Really constructed to be that way, verbal and math. So when he was doing analyses and reporting results as examples, he had a circumstance that no longer is really present. That is, even with the SAT is no longer a unidimensional test. It's evolved into a testing program that's much more similar to the ACT assessment than it is to the old SAT. So when IRT was being developed, the context was people were thinking about, well, these tests are unidimensional. And so, yes, they had the assumption, but they also had tests that were constructed that way. These days, that's not true, or at least it's very rarely true. The only ones I know of that I've ever worked on a bit were ASVAB, which are typically quite unidimensional, the ASVAB tests. For the most part, licensure and certification tests, admissions tests, tests used in K through 12 are not unidimensional any longer. In fact, they're constructed, and people brag about the fact that they aren't unidimensional. They do test multiple things in multiple different ways. So in a sense, I think it's not that the methodology of IRT is harder. I don't think it's necessarily harder, but there are equating issues that arise in IRT that I think are actually more challenging than in other methods.
Yeah, okay. I agree, thank you. So there's another question, there's a lot of questions coming in now, so by the way. That's great. So this is a contextual question, it's kind of specific. So, for example, in an operational testing program that uses only classical equating methods due to small sample size, if there was an item that was found problematic and had to be excluded from the scoring set, what equating method or approach would be best, given that only pass and fail decisions are made? I don't know if there's really a great answer for this, but.
Well, if you've got a problematic item, you should exclude it for sure. You should exclude it from if you split the items into common items, an internal set of common items, and the rest of the items, if it's a problematic item, you should exclude it from wherever it is. Now, it is possible if you have a common item set and you exclude an item from it, that common item set no longer represents the full length test. But I would hope you would have chosen a set of common items that was long enough so that wouldn't be a serious problem. At some point, I suspect both Jamie and Wanchun will talk about common item sets. I spend a lot when I teach a full length course, I spend a lot of time on that. It's a tricky issue to figure out how many common items you need. But if you've got a problematic item, you get rid of it as completely as you possibly can. I don't think there's much question about that, no matter what.
Okay, move on to the next question. Thanks. How do you control for the cohort effect when you do equating in like a testing window situation? And that was the question.
Whoever asked the question, can you tell me what you mean by a cohort effect? Has multiple meanings for me.
Yeah, how? Some?
Hi, yes, because usually the people coming to the earlier windows, usually the stronger takers. So when maybe I'm talking about scaling, if we use the initial form to do the scale and then equate back to that initial form, because this cohort effect is that cause some kind of disadvantage to later takers, even doing equating?
I don't know that I can answer that question without having a lot more knowledge about the context, but you mentioned windows. And it is certainly true in some testing programs that there are equating windows, and some examinees who test in an early window may be more able on average than examinees who test in later windows. If you were conducting equating, you would have to have some methodology to account for that, for sure. And I think it can be done, but without knowing an awful lot more of the details, I don't think I can give you a sensible answer right now. I'm sorry.
That's all right, thank you.
Okay, so from John Wickett, he says, thanks for the great session. Could you elaborate on what statistical properties you would prioritize for equivalence when building forms under the common item design?
Well, the quick answer would be same specifications. Going back. The quick answer always is going to be having the common items have the same specifications, content and statistical, as the forms X and Y. That to me, I prioritize. I'm not exactly sure what the focus of your question is completely, but I personally prioritize design issues over everything else. That is, I do not start out with an assumption if I pick a really good methodology that will solve design issue problems. So my personal priority is always design issues, which is one of the reasons why, as I've said several times, I actually believe, and I know it's not common practice, maybe others would very much disagree with me, but I actually believe it's important for psychometricians to know a heck of a lot about what's going on in test development, and for test development people to actually know something about the psychometrics that's involved, so they know talk at cross purposes. Is that too vague, or is that good enough?
No, I think that's okay. John, if you want to chime in, you can.
Sure, I wouldn't mind asking a bit more, I guess, detail on that. And I'm thinking more around, so if I'm looking to build two forms, a new form, to equate back to a previous form, like thinking sort of, 3 or 4 test events a year kind of situation. And I totally get the content comparability and equivalence. But in terms of the stats that you would focus on, so I want to build forms that have, that are likely to have the same mean, standard deviation, almost sure. But beyond that, what would you focus on?
Okay, John, I got it better now. Now I get you going. I would always prefer to have things line up along the full score scale. So I'd kind of prefer equipercentile equating, unless the circumstances you are dealing with are circumstances within which decisions are only made about examinees within a specified region of the score scale. And then I might back off from that. And furthermore, if they're only made within the region of the score scale, I might want to look at statistics I haven't even mentioned here, such as false positives, false negatives, classification errors, stuff like that. So if you got basic, proficient, advanced, for example, I might look at false positive, false negative errors under various circumstances. That's far beyond, well, not far beyond, that's kind of beyond what I had intended to cover today. But I would probably like to look at those. But all other things being equal, given a choice, if I've got to pick one and only one methodology, and that's all I can do, I'll pick observed score equal percentile equating. And then I'll pay attention to the full range of the score scale. But there are many circumstances in which that's not possible, others in which there might be a better alternative. But if you want me to pick one overall best choice, give me a random groups design and equal percentile equating. And more often than not, that'll do it. But they are demanding. That is, a random groups design is demanding. It costs time and effort to do. And equal percentile equating is demanding if you don't have enough data, because you won't be able to estimate results equivalence at the ends of the score scale. And sometimes that's very important, and sometimes it's very unimportant. So in college admissions testing programs, it's very important to do a good job at the top end of the score scale. Tests like MCAT, that's probably true as well. Many grade level testing programs just do a pretty good job in the middle of the score scale, and you're probably going to be okay. Sometimes they don't even know what the top of the score scale is or the bottom is. That help at all?
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so next question by Ramon Grover. When equating single forms across administrations, is the process the same as equating across test forms within an administration?
Well, let's see. Equating test forms within a single administration would mean something like having two random subgroups. And the first part was what?
Versus equating single forms across administrations. So a single form given across different administrations versus.
Well, if by single form you mean the same form across administrations, you'd have no equating, because the equating, once an equating is established for a form, you don't go back and redo it unless there's some reason to believe you made a mistake the first time. So if that's the question, then there's nothing to do. If by across a single administration you mean two different forms, then that's basically either a random groups design or a common item design, where you've got two different forms involved. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. I think that was the best response you can give. So last question we have 2 minutes left. What are the sample size requirements for the test takers, the exam items, and anchor sets for a sound equating?
Say those three again.
What are the sample size requirements for the test takers, the exam items, and anchor sets for a sound equating?
They're all sample size questions, right?
Yeah, all sample size, like, yeah.
For the number of examinees, okay.
Yeah, number of items in the test and the number of anchor. It says an anchor set, so I'm assuming the size of the anchor set.
The anchor set, okay. In a full-length course, I spent a lot of time on this at various points within the course, and probably you, Jamie, and Juan Sean will spend some time. I'll give you a rough idea. I like equal percentile equating. Typically, to do it well, tends to be 3,000 examinees, more or less. But I've done it with as few as 1,000. Number of items in today's testing programs, For the most part, tests are 30 to 40 items at least, up to 60 or 70. They don't tend to go too much longer, except the National Board of Medical Examiners on its step exams. I think some of them have 500 items. Anchor item set, it needs to represent the full length test. Generally speaking, somewhere between 20 and 40% probably represents the full length test in most contexts. But all of those are they're not mired in stone. They're guidelines, and very weak guidelines probably, that you have to look intensely at in the context of the specific testing program that you really have. Beyond that, in a specific testing program context, I think I could come up with recommendations on all three of them. And then if you independently asked Mike Coleman, or Wanshan Lee, or Jamie Malatesta to independently ask, I don't think we all differ a lot, but I suspect we differ a little.
Yep. Well said. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Brennan. We are out of time for today. I really enjoyed your session. It was a really good refresher for me, things I haven't thought about in a little while. So next week we have Dr. Wanshan Lee, who is professor at the University of Iowa. He'll be giving a training session on classical equating methods, just as a preview. But thank you so much, Dr. Brennan, for your time and for your volunteering for this event.
Thank you for the attention of all of those of you who have listened to me for a couple of hours, and for Jamie and Stella doing this. I hope it helps.
It did, sure did. Thank you. Okay.
Okay.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.